So how's 2021 so far? We having fun yet? I know I am. There seemed to be, as things got more exaggerated throughout 2020 and less clear, there was a tendency to believe this one change will fix everything. All we have to do is win the election. All we have to do is get to the inauguration. And now it's becoming quite clear that the road back to normal is going to be much longer than we expected. So with that in mind, and with a lot of questions and a lot of accusations going around and a lot of big, scary words being said, I thought, why not have a big conversation with the person I discuss scary words with, and that's my thesis advisor, right over here. Everybody say hello to Professor at the U.S. Army, not Naval, I almost said Naval, the U.S. Army War College, Ron Granieri.
Hello, MK. Hello, everybody.
Now, the last time we spoke, I think I was reaching out to say, it was right after Charlottesville, and I said, Antifa, is that really in the States? I remember vaguely hearing about them in Europe, but never really encountering them or hearing them discussed in this manner.
Right.
And you were like, well...
Yeah, I mean, one can argue, there's Antifa as long as there's FA. So I can tell you that for myself, as somebody who studies modern Germany, before I get started, I always have to say that anything I say is, of course, my own opinion and not that of the U.S. Army War College, the Department of Defense, the Emperor Palpatine, or anybody else in particular. That's just me. So, but I first learned about it.
You're also talking to me. The fact that anyone would allow you to talk to me on a live stream with a microphone is obviously turning a blind eye.
It's just, I think we all like to live a little dangerously, and so it's all part of the fun. But yeah, I mean, I first heard about Antifa literally when I was doing my research on post-war Germany, and it was a broad name that was sort of self-defined by folks who were all in the aftermath of the Nazi collapse, right? And they saw themselves as, they set up local committees, basically, that were they had hoped would be part of whatever post-war government would come, and these committees were pretty broadly based at first. I mean, they included, everybody from communists on one end all the way over to sort of moderate centrist opponents of the Nazi regime. Gradually, the term became more commonly used among people further to the left. And gradually, as political parties developed in post-war Europe, right, there is no Antifa party. And so it becomes a kind of a name that people who think of themselves on the left and opposing authoritarianism, that they give themselves. And, I would say that it's that different groups have given themselves names. During the 60s in the United States, right, people didn't call themselves Antifa, even though we think of 60s protesters, a lot of them would have probably, that's basically what we were talking about. And so the term has made a real comeback, interestingly enough, in the post-Cold War world.
That has nothing to do with self-identification, at least in the last 3 years.
Well, and the thing is it's both. There are some people who call themselves it, but it's also become a term that's being used by people who are worried about protest movements to accuse that, to create this image of a sort of an organized, dangerous revolutionary force that has to be fought back against. And and everybody remembers the image of Richard Spencer being on the streets of Washington, being punched in the head by somebody, right? And so Antifa has sort of blended in, I would argue, or has become mixed with a certain kind of, if you think about the beginning of the 20th century out in Seattle, the sort of anti-globalization protesters and the Occupy types wearing their black balaclavas and everything. That's kind of, that's the demographic we're talking about. So these people have been around for a while. I guess people do age out of being Antifa, but there's always more 20-year-olds who want to break windows and cause trouble.
Yeah, well, but again, that being the characterization, because a lot of that has been, since I have come to the left and really been openly part of it, I know that the danger of it is it's not an organization. It's not a thing. So whenever, and they've been threatening to call Antifa a terrorist organization, for at least since the summer, maybe since Charlottesville, and the danger of right now calling what's happening in DC calling them domestic terrorists, if they anything that they enact to take up the actual white supremacists will be the same cloak they use to continue to come down on us. So where's the government drawing the line? What do we do? It makes me feel scary and dangerous to moderates who otherwise would be like, hey, yeah, Black Lives Matter.
Right. And I think this is a real, I've been wrestling with this too. When you try to talk to people about how they should react to things that they really do think of as significant problems, right? Significant problems that need that, and if you tell people, well, yeah, there are problems, but you all should calm down a little bit, right? That's not necessarily helpful. But when I say this as somebody who is, still considers himself more on the center right, that it should be possible to solve the problems of a democratic society using the institutions of the democratic society, right? That we shouldn't be looking to create chaos or violence for the sake of it. That a danger that sort of looms, and I don't want to both sides this, but I will say, well, I'll say this one time. A danger that looms is when accelerationists, people who think that making things worse now will somehow create a kind of healthy shock that will then lead to the promised land. That this is very dangerous because that leads to violence, and it also scares off people in the middle. It makes people feel like there are only two terrible choices, and then they will decide to either sit it out or they'll just let it happen. And this is where, one of the interesting things going back to last week is that in advance of January 6th, a lot of protest movements, or a lot of social justice groups were telling people, don't go to Washington, don't be there, don't get into arguments with these people, because an acceleration of violence doesn't help anybody, or it only helps the forces that we don't want to help. And that, I think, is the real challenge for people who feel like, right, I want change and I want it now, is how patient are they willing to be? And yet I think that we have enough historical examples to show that showing patience, winning over the sort of wavering middle of the society, is a better way to build long-term change. But it doesn't feel like, it's not as much fun, and it doesn't give you that same visceral thrill. But when you think about the difference between, say, the Stop the Steal rally last week and the Women's March, which would have been about a year ago or 4 years ago next weekend, right? So a march that takes place after Trump has been nominated, right? A lot more people, but you'll notice the Women's March did not storm the Capitol, didn't break windows, right? And made a very powerful impression and probably won over more supporters. Whereas the folks who are engaged in the violence aren't, they're trying to mobilize the people who already agree with them and scare the people who don't. And that they're not necessarily trying to win over new converts.
Well, I think I'm not sure the Women's March did either, quite frankly. And as a woman, I can tell you absolutely color changed after the Women's March. That's why I didn't go to any subsequent ones. And to the point about Black Bloc, this is just something to consider. I've been quite open about the fact that I was violently sexually assaulted on 2 different occasions. Both times I went to the police. Both times nothing came of it. And the first time I had been stalked, and I had filed complaints about the person and was told not to worry about it. And then that was used against me. Well, you knew them, so you sure you're not trying to get back at your boyfriend, when I didn't actually know this person. So the police are not helpful now in today when I'm saying, hey, people know that I like Black people. My kids talk about it. It's a thing. And there's some white supremacists that really don't like that, who've made direct threats to me. I'd like to log them. And they're like, oh, that's on Twitter. That's not real, even though the president governs there. So I would argue that really very little has changed. We just marched. And how long should I have to wait for that type of change to come? I mean, it's hard to be patient when it's your body on the line. It is. And that's where I don't, it is hard, MK, and I don't want to I don't want to make it sound like I have all the answers on this, but that's right. But I did do that privately. But I do think, this is where it gets, really where the rubber meets the road. We're talking about, real social problems, and the idea of, how are we supposed to, in a free society,
that basically part of the freedom of a free society is letting people be jerks.
Right.
Up to a point. Is how do we find the ways to encourage people to behave better, to limit, obviously terrible behavior. And the stalking example is a very painful example of just how badly our legal system functions.
Prioritizes the freedom of white men over the safety of everybody else.
Indeed. And I would say that it prioritizes the freedom of the freedom of the aggressive law flouter, because they say, well, he hasn't broken the law yet. And that I think is that's the central problem, is how do you create a society where you can recognize, because we don't have pre-crime, we don't live in the Minority Report, right? What's that?
They're trying to build it.
They're trying to build it. Well, I see, and that's it. You think about what that would mean for people's freedom of expression or freedom of thought, right? Mm-hmm. So we want people to be able to think what they want to think, but we also want to be able to punish people as soon as they do something, as soon as they go beyond merely thinking. And yet you could make the argument that even allowing people to think, allowing people to engage in dangerous fantasizing, is that them blowing off steam, or is that them rehearsing for the terrible things they're going to do? And in a free society, to figure out how do we respect freedom in a way that allows everybody to be free. So not just the white guys who have the advantages in a society, but also the other people who have an equal claim to their freedom and their security. And this is what I think about with we should be allowed to have intense political disagreements. Completely intense political disagreements. And we can even disagree about, whether the long-term shape of the Constitution is, ideal, right? If people want to do complete change. But we also have to be willing to, the Germans have a phrase which they came up with after World War II, because they didn't have it before World War II, which they would call wehrhafte Demokratie. So a democracy that can defend itself. And so that means that in Germany, like in some other European states, right, there are certain political activities, certain political slogans, certain political symbols are banned, right? Even in a free society, as they say, we can be free, but freedom is not a suicide pact, because there is always the danger that people will take advantage of their freedom to the point where they will, the phrase that my wife and I talk about this a lot. The phrase we talk about is often, right, the polite are at the mercy of the rude, right? Correct. If you're ever if there's only one rude person in a room and everybody else is polite, that rude person will make noise, will make trouble, and the polite people will sit quietly and think, well, maybe this person will stop on their own because I don't want to make it worse.
Okay, I'm typing that down. I'm putting that a lot. Yeah.
That's and you think about that, what that means for politics as well, is the irresponsible are at the can create problems. I mean, I can think of this everything from individual lifestyle, but even to use a geopolitical example, right? The debate about Brexit, right? Is the British decide that they're going to smash up the European Union, and they say, and we want a deal, but we're not going to make any compromises. And the European Union states are like, well, we don't want to have a completely broken relationship with you, so we'll keep making suggestions for changes until we find for deals until we find one that you can agree to. Mm-hmm. And that's where the irresponsible party is like waiting for the responsible party to come up with a solution to the problem. Because the irresponsible party is like, I'm irresponsible. I'll do whatever I want for as long as I want. And I think that's where what we may be seeing now in the United States. It's kind of the frustration of the people who were told they were supposed to follow the rules. Right. Are now watching these folks go all to the point where they're walking around saying, my rights are being restricted because because the guy that I voted for lost this election. Yeah. And the people who want it have to say, well, that's what we have to, you got to deal with that. Right. And you're not allowed just to destroy everything, and you're not allowed to count on us, for them, those same people then to turn around and say, well, we can't impeach the president, or we can't do anything else because that will be disunity. It's like, who was here trying to invalidate the votes of 81 million people last week, right? And so that's where I think that so it's a challenge. I see it everywhere from the individual level to the societal level, is how can you be true to your principles about how society should work when you're dealing with people who are more than happy to flout every one of those principles and to cause all this trouble because they are that selfish and that irresponsible.
Yeah, it was so, because that, I feel like that, to go back a little bit to, it's the strength of the institutions. I have felt since being in here that there, when I'm out on the street, when I'm engaging with people, there are those who believe in the system so much so that they check out, like, oh, this will work itself out, the US is fine. And others who are like, no, the system is broken, it doesn't work for me, it doesn't work for anyone I know, it hasn't worked for my family, it hasn't worked for 400 years plus. And it's really hard to convert people who, until they see the system break, and then it breaks on them, which then ruins their credibility when they try to talk about it, because you're a victim of it. So, and from that perspective, do you think things are broken? What is your?
I do think things are. I try to be hopeful, try to be both gloomy and hopeful at the same time, right? So I think, basically, people are terrible and the world is terrible, but we also have this moral responsibility to try to make it better.
So German.
Right? Isn't it? You like that? But this, I think, is and so when you look around and you realize that there are elements of our society that can only function if people are willing to embrace a kind of shared sense of humanity, a shared sense of citizenship. And yet we have, there are people in this society who simply don't see their fellow citizens as equally worthy of respect. And I mean, in a sense, I think we're being confronted with the reality that a society like ours, based on maximizing freedom of individuals, is a wonderful society, right? It allows you and me to be the people that we are today. Okay, right? So it's done a lot. Right.
Sorry, that's got to be said.
That's all right. That's right. I mean, but that's what I would say is that that all along, right? That society made those promises that if everybody, that there's all this freedom, but sort of assumed that everybody would know what they were going to do with it.
Yeah.
And that everybody would be okay with that same freedom being extended to other citizens as well. Mm-hmm. But we are being confronted, even though, anybody who's read any history knows that for a lot of people who live in this country have been denied that fellow citizenship for a long time. And that we're to the point now where we're actually, there have been big moves towards extending that citizenship. And the result has been this powerful backlash from people who are saying, no, because somehow granting these other folks the same rights or the same privileges, the same status that I have somehow harms me. Mm-hmm. That it is deeply disconcerting, because you can only have a functioning democratic republic if people realize that there's more than one answer to a lot of practical questions. First of all, that sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but you still have elections. But second of all, is to realize that there are some issues that should be outside of or above day-to-day politics. Right? People should be allowed to live their lives the way they want to live their lives. People should be allowed to love whom they love. People should be allowed to, people should be given should have the freedom to be, and Jeff, you're right. I mean, race is the breaking point of American democracy, right? This is where, for a long time, right, the assumption was that, white Americans could pretend that everybody was equal as long as they didn't actually have to interact with anybody of another race. White Americans have been given the opportunity, let's just say this, have been given the opportunity to show that they really mean what they say when they say all people are created equal. And white Americans have failed repeatedly to live up to that. Now, all white Americans, I'm not going to get into that debate, right? Some people are nicer than others, but when we see what has happened this summer, right? When we see, can you imagine? I mean, everybody said this, so I'm going to say it too, right? Can you imagine if a BLM group had knocked over a bunch of Capitol guards in Washington and had busted into the Capitol building? Would they have been allowed to stand around and mill around and then walk out and go home?
Oh, no, definitely not. But we also would have had drag queens handing out food. We would have had medical stations. We would have had safe houses nearby. We would have had a plan. It would have been really different. It would have been a lot more spectacular, but it would have to be, because we know what we'd be meeting. I still can't believe what I witnessed that day versus this summer. I've talked about this before. I'm going to keep talking about it till the day I die. Standing over a person of color who was trying to pull a rubber bullet out of a man's chest, mm-hmm. who hadn't even been part of it. He just got caught in a crossfire because the police didn't know what they were doing, while the police officer tried to mace her, reaching around me to mace her while I locked arms with the people next to me. It was so surreal. There was none of that. I don't think when there was tear gas in the rotunda, I was like, yeah, how many canisters? One, all blister little buttons. It's like, it was hard not to laugh at it because it was so pathetic. And that's also what makes me nervous. Because as someone who already doesn't trust the police or the institutions, how much coordination was there? There had to have been a lot. Pelosi's office is not easy to find. I've been in that building. I was a White House intern.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go ahead and take your shots, audience. Yeah, I was started 2 weeks before Monica Lewinsky became a household name. But it was such a, it's like, how did you, and then you get there and all you can do is pick up the phone. You're not even like copying files. Not that I think they should have, but like they clearly had no plan because they hadn't expected to get that far. I think.
Well, and I we're going to have a job, and I as a historian, I get tired of people saying, historians of the future will deal with this because, I don't know whether and nobody pays attention to me today. I don't know why anybody's going to pay attention to me in the future, except all you nice people out there. But I do think that we will have a hard time. But it will be an important challenge to sort of figure out, how do we divide, this crowd clearly had some people who were MAGA tourists. It had some people who were seasoned veterans, right? Because there were some people who were identified in the crowd who had been at other state protests, other places. The dudes who had zip ties, the people who were carrying weapons of one kind or another. Right? Some people had ideas about what they were going to do.
They had coolers of Molotov cocktails. Their justification for shooting us over the summer was the fact that we had water bottles. People are handing out free water. They can't tell the difference between a bottle of water and a Molotov cocktail. So they got to shoot us, but not the people with
Molotov cocktails. And of course, we're back to the polite at the mercy of the rude thing, right? Is that I don't know if you heard this, but last week, right, some people were saying, well, we didn't want to have too strong a police presence because we realized that we'd been too heavy-handed over the summer. That some people said that, like that's why they were going to be so soft. And it's like, yeah, no. But that is indeed an argument that was made in some circles. And so we clearly people should be allowed to march. People should be allowed to shout. People should be allowed to say what they want to say. It's a free country. People should be allowed to raise their fists. People should be allowed to shake them in the air. They should not be allowed to punch policemen. They should not be allowed to smash windows. They should not be allowed to burn businesses. They shouldn't be allowed to storm the Capitol building. And to try to figure out as a society, though, how we are going to, what are we going to do going forward? Like, because I don't think that, the protests from this summer certainly haven't led to any major improvements or changes that I've noticed.
We've also been working really hard on the policy end too.
Yeah. You mentioned you go to county council meetings.
Yeah, man. That's why I'm missing one right now. Chief Pazin is going to respond to the Office of the Independent Monitor's report on the excessive force over the summer. I know what he's going to say, like this is terrible. But we enacted Senate Bill SB 217, which eliminated qualified immunity. We expected that to have a ripple effect. You can no longer shoot people in the back as they walk away legally as a police officer, and you can be sued personally for it, which is a big deal. We got rid of the chokehold, no more kneeling on necks, and every time that. They've only done it twice since that we're aware of because filing class action lawsuits. So we've been able to use the system to push back too, but maybe that's just specific to Colorado. But yeah, we've had some changes.
No, this is good to know. I mean,
and that we had to break windows in order to get there, but no one really cared until no one cared about black bodies until white businesses were burning. And then you had people saying, and the riots, let's give them what they want.
Well, and I will say, that is a sad sort of recurring theme, right? Is nobody notices anything until something really terrible happens, and it's like, oh, why'd you have to do that terrible thing? Why didn't you just tell me that there was racism in this country, right? Why didn't you just tell me that the police were mistreating people, right? If you told me, I totally would have done something about that. No, and this is where everybody's got to be, and I will say, people in charge have to be honest and look in the mirror and realize how much of the problems how much of the criticisms that they're absorbing right now are things that they basically knew were wrong, but they hoped nobody was going to notice. It's like after what happened in Ferguson in 2014, there are all these stories about how the local officials in Ferguson had been engaged in sort of long-term mistreatment of the population, right? That essentially Ferguson's, the problems of local governments that were funding their budgets based on citations that they were issuing to people, and what this does to the relationship between the citizens and the people who are supposed to be policing them. Okay, you want to say the first time you didn't completely understand how bad things were. Well, none of this should be a surprise. And so the question should be, what are we going to do to create a society where we actually do respect each other and we actually do recognize our common humanity and our common citizenship? Because if we don't, and this is what I think is the great paradox here, is that ideally a free society like ours is, like the United States of America aspires to be, is based on the idea that there are things that are in the realm of politics that we debate about and we disagree about, and then there are sort of rights and privileges and duties that come to every citizen that are non-negotiable. And so we can argue about tax rates, right? We can argue about how much to spend on the Defense Department. We can argue about lots of things, but we shouldn't argue about whether every man and every woman in this society who should be treated with some basic level of respect. And if we can't figure out how to make that, if we can't figure out how to express that in the things that we do, then all of our promises of our society are hollow. Mm-hmm. And this is where societies fall apart when all societies are built around sort of a willing suspension of disbelief, right? Because most people have very little interaction with big politics, right? Most people don't, and most people just sort of assume that life's going to go on more or less. I've got my concerns, and I'm going to deal with my day-to-day concerns, and life's going to go on around them. But what happens when the time comes that people look around and say, "But if I don't trust anybody around me, if I just feel like every time I go out, anything could happen," then society breaks down. And that's the way that a lot of Black citizens in this country have lived for a long time, right? The idea that they are not allowed to be equally free in all places. Yep. And we need to recognize that, not just recognize that's wrong when we all go watch a movie that makes it obvious that it's wrong by caricaturing the villains so that we all know we're not supposed to identify with Bryce Dallas Howard in The Help. Yeah. When actually, when we are all actually Bryce Dallas Howard in The Help.
I'm going to help you by not helping you. Please eliminate Social Security. No, we don't need to take care of the poor or the addicted.
Right. Yeah. No, and that's just if we're serious about our own rights and being treated with respect, then you treat other people with respect, right? You would think that's simple and obvious, but it's not. And democratic societies have fallen apart because groups in that society are not willing to accept that, that they might lose an election, that they might lose an argument. It's when people feel like somehow, oh my gosh, I can't possibly lose, because if I lose forever, right? That's what leads to the breakdown of democratic societies.
And God, that just feels so ridiculous to me as a woman who I have to plan my run routes before I go and make sure my husband knows where I'm going, because you never know. And then it'll be my fault because of what I was wearing. Still, despite the fact that I'm old or whatever, it's very there's nothing you can do to make it not your fault when you're a victim here in so many ways. So when it's like you're pissed because you lost, it's so ridiculous, but that they have so much power that's what we're talking about, and that's what matters. Or that will be, if there is a flexion point, it'll be that. Do you think that's the flexion point?
Do I think that's a flexion point? I think that it's a real issue of, that we have a big chunk of the society. One could argue that the last 4 years have been a long barbaric yawp from a section of society that feels like it is losing its dominant position. Mm-hmm. And this is the thing, right? You look, I'm not telling anybody who's watching this that they don't know, right? I'm a white dude in my 50s. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm not going to pretend that I'm perfect. And I'll also say, right, I understand the things that white dudes in their 50s are worried about. And yet, to my fellow white dudes in your 50s, it is possible to live in peace and mutual respect, not only with the women that you know personally, but with all women. And hey, white folks, it is possible to live with respect with all fellow citizens, no matter what color they are and no matter where they come from. You're going to be fine. You guys are going to be fine, right? There'll still be plenty of Bud Light. Don't worry. And yet the political entrepreneurs out there who think that it's somehow better to make people angry and scared all the time. Mm-hmm. Granted, there's a lot of money in making people angry and scared. Right? I don't know. Maybe I'd be making more money right now if I had a TV show telling people how they should be angry and scared every night.
Hey, I had a marketing person last year telling me what you needed to do to runners, make them angry and scared and nervous and insecure, and you'll make all kinds of money. And I'm like, I'm here to combat all that. Come on.
Right. It's right. I actually want to make the world a better place, and we can do that. That's the thing and you know what? This is, my own background, whatever. I won't, my own imperfections. I won't lay them all on you. But the whole point is everybody knows how terrible everybody is. Everybody knows how terrible they are. Everybody knows how wrong they are. Everybody knows how many things they got wrong.
Yeah.
And you have a chance to do things better. And that's true of individuals. It's true of societies. And this is also where, the big debate we have about, the 1619 Project at the New York Times, right? How do we confront racism in American society, right? There's a lot of people who feel like, oh my gosh, we can't talk about racism or slavery because then we won't be able to talk about how great Thomas Jefferson was. And it's like, well, we can talk about how great the Declaration of Independence was. We can even talk about some of the good things Thomas Jefferson. I'm not a huge Thomas Jefferson fan, but I'll just throw that out there. But we should be able to talk about the terrible things that we've done as a country. Because you can't have, everybody loves the stories of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. Everybody loves the sanitized story that we have of Martin Luther King, but they all want, or even with John Lewis. And yet, but at the same time, we want the happy part of the story without realizing just how awful things were, right? That made their bravery necessary.
Right.
And we need to understand what made that bravery necessary if we're going to really appreciate the bravery.
Yeah. So for those who think that what happened at the Capitol recently was brave, what's going to be the change coming out of that?
I don't know. This is where, and I will say that one of that day last week was sad on a lot of levels. What I thought was the saddest of all was that after all of that protesting, that certain members of the Congress still felt it was necessary to get up and give essentially the same speeches they were planning on giving, challenging the election. I mean, you could have set aside, you say, you know what, I think from this day forward, I'm going to work for an election commission that's going to deal with elections, if that's really what you're concerned about.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the vast missed opportunity, and some people accepted this opportunity. Right? Mitch McConnell, person I'm often critical of, gave one heck of a speech on Wednesday night. Right? Got to give him that. And yet, if people can't bring themselves to say, I'm going to put aside all the fundraising I've been doing about scaring people that's about voter fraud that doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. I want, that I really want the country to come together. That was a missed opportunity. And it's a slow motion missed opportunity. Now we can say, just like other missed opportunities, right? I didn't run today. I believe this would be about the 35,000th day in my life that I did not get up in the morning and run, but tomorrow, who knows, maybe I will. And maybe if with the proper inspiration. And so we can do better. And we can only do better if we want to do better. We can only want to do better if we take the time to try to listen to the reasons why we should be better. And so that's why people should seek out conversations with people they disagree with. People should resist the temptation to assume that they know everything about somebody based on where they look or where they work or what they do. But that's drip. Those are drips of water on a hard stone, right? Because we cannot expect there to be change right away. And this goes back to the patience question, right? Because there are plenty of people who've waited a long time to be treated like citizens in this country.
Yeah.
Right. And, we should start, we need to keep pushing forward. And this means all of us who want to create a better society have to be willing to talk to each other, to understand where we're coming from, and to look for ways to try to advance our vision for a better America and a better world.
Yeah.
But, and to realize that, as I say, the world's terrible. People are terrible. We've always been terrible. But, we're still here, and where there's life, there's hope, and have been that have been less terrible than others. So our should try to make things less terrible.
Well, it's funny that kind of brings back full circle to the beginning, because the terrible's been coming directly at me. My family's receiving direct threats of what's going to happen on the 20th on their way to the Capitol. And instead of calling the police, I call Black Bloc, because I know they're going to show up and I know they're going to protect me, because there's a whole bunch of us who can't call the police. And Antifa, it's not an official organization, but it's people who get it, see it, and are willing to protect you, which is something the police have never done for a whole lot of us. And that's been such a game-changing thing. So the better way is being built on a macro level. And I never would have known it if I hadn't gotten involved in my community.
And this is where the more you know your fellow citizens, the more you appreciate where they're coming from, the better a relationship can be. And, I will say that, every community in U.S. history, communities have, begun by policing and defending themselves in opposition to the state, until they've gradually felt respected enough or accepted enough in the state to feel like that they can count on those institutions to work for them as well. And as I say, things can get better. Things are better in some ways. Things are not perfect. And we still have, when I was in one of my first teaching jobs, my great experience teaching it down in South Carolina at Furman, go Paladins. I had a colleague in the education department who was a very nice man, who was from the backwoods. He had a great sort of Southern accent and all those kind of things. And he never had a bad word to say about a student. The worst, when it was a student who was a total problem, right? Somebody who really just couldn't do the work or was having those problems, he would just say, that young man has unlimited potential for improvement. And
I love that.
And so that's where we are. And this, I keep thinking at the end of, to go on the completely other intellectual or the other social scale, right? At the end of Annie Hall, the joke at the end of the movie Annie Hall is, that we have my brother thinks he's a chicken, and the guy goes to the doctor and he says, we're trying to figure out what we can do, because we don't think we don't think that he should think he's a chicken, but we do need the eggs. That we're trying to, we are trying to figure out, how to recognize our weaknesses to try to build our society through our unlimited potential for improvement. This is not the historical lecture I was planning on giving today. This is a lot more fun.
It is. But if you had to compare what happened last week to any other historical event, what's the most similar one?
Well, similar one. It's a tough call, because in American history, right, we have examples of politically motivated riots, but they're usually at the state level. Most famously at the turn of the century in Wilmington, North Carolina, when a white mob basically decided, rebelled against a fusionist Republican Democrat black-white government and literally chased it away and overthrew it. So we have that at the state level. And there are other smaller examples in the 1870s, 1890s, and race riots, well into the 1920s. So the example that everybody wants to give, which I will mention, is of course the beer hall putsch in Germany in 1923, because it failed, because it seemed vaguely ridiculous, and yet we know that 10 years later, the same guys who organized that putsch end up taking over all of Germany. So that was Hitler's first stab at government. It's hard to know what to do with that example, because sadly enough, right, the beer hall putsch in 1923 in Munich was one of several attempts to overthrow the government of Germany in the 1920s. And so at the time, the reason why people didn't necessarily see that Hitler was a unique threat is because even local efforts to overthrow the government were not so unique. And so things can get lost in the details. I think one lesson we can draw from that is that, when somebody tells you that they try to, when somebody shows that they're willing to overthrow the government and be violent, is remember that when they come back and claim to be a respectable politician, and make them prove it otherwise. I do have one positive example though, and this I was so proud of myself that I thought of this. I did not timestamp it, but I thought of this on January 6th, January 7th, and then I saw somebody had written about it. And that is, I don't know how many of you know much history of modern Spain, but Spain was a republic that was overthrown. A military coup in 1936 leads to a very bloody civil war. By 1939, General Franco and the nationalists, they overthrow the republic, and Spain becomes a authoritarian government from 1939 until 1975, when Franco dies. Mm-hmm. And when Franco dies, he had announced that his successor would be the king. At that point, actually, the son of the current king of Spain, Juan Carlos, would take over. And Juan Carlos, when Franco dies in 1975, Juan Carlos presides over Spain's democratic transition. So Spain goes back to being a republic. But after just a couple of years of the republic, some army officers and other conservative elements in society were unhappy with the idea that they were losing all the power that they enjoyed in Franco days. And so in 1981, there is actually an effort by a group of army officers. They storm into the National Assembly. They pronounce the republic overthrown. They say they're going to turn back the clock. They're going to make Spain great again. And they expect that Juan Carlos will support them. But the king, and Juan Carlos turns out to be, not the best human being in the world, as if you read the news about Juan Carlos Day. But in 1981, Juan Carlos said, "No, I am not standing with you guys. I'm standing with the republic." And even though they stormed into the Capitol building, even though they stood on the speaker's rostrum, even though they announced they were going to overthrow everything, their coup falls apart. And in the elections the following year, not only is the republic strengthened, but the people of Spain elect Felipe González and the socialists to government for the first time since the 1930s. That Spain's not only going to be a republic, but Spain's republic is going to move in an even more progressive direction, because the people of Spain confronted with the possibility of going back in a direction that they didn't want to go in. They said, "Well, we're going to save this republic, and we're going to make it stronger." And Spain has not been threatened by that kind of internal trouble ever since, going on 40 years. And so these kinds of efforts, they happen in lots of different places. They don't necessarily all have to lead to catastrophe, even though it's a terrible thing for any society to have to go through. The challenge is, what lessons will people take away from the experience, right? When people need to ask themselves, right, how did I feel when I saw what was happening on Wednesday, January 6th? And if I felt sick to my stomach, if I felt scared, if I felt angry, then I have to see, what can I do to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen again? And how can I strengthen the republic? How can I strengthen a sense of democratic purpose, so that we don't face these kinds of things again?
Because I think what made it so difficult for me to digest, or easy, I'm not sure, of what was happening on the 6th, was the fact that 3 days prior, I watched an interview with a woman who had been in a long-term relationship with a guy, and she called the police and she called the FBI and said, "Hey, he's building a bomb in the RV, and he's written this manifesto, and it's really scary, and I don't know what to do." And they gave her a psych eval, and they made her feel shamed, and they didn't do anything, and they told her why they couldn't do anything. So she broke up with the guy and left. And what I watched was, at the behest of her attorney, saying, "You need to go live and you need to tell your story, so they cannot come back and stick you with accessory after the fact," like Tanya Harding, who didn't report that, didn't turn her husband in for planning this. Not that they would have done anything anyway, but because she did, they used that to put her in jail. That's still the legal precedent. I had no idea. You need to get that legal precedent. Yeah. So she gave an interview, and I remember watching that thinking, 18 months before the bombing, 18 months. He had to change the date of the bombing even, because she gave up the whole plan. And now I'm like, so the FBI knew and did nothing, because, freedom. It's amazing. Can't take any of that away. And then reading that the FBI had been warning that, hey, but this is going to be really bad. And so nothing. And so this happened. So that's kind of what do you do when no one's taking the actual threat seriously? It's hard not to be scared.
It is hard not to be scared.
You don't.
Yeah. I should say, one of the things I do with the War College is I host a podcast. And one of my former students, who's both a Army officer and an FBI agent, he's in the National Guard. He did a project on radicalization in the ranks, and basically this kind of question is: what do you do when you see that somebody is drifting in a very dangerous direction? What can you do? And the temptation in a lot of institutions is when they catch somebody who's becoming radicalized, is to say, well, we're going to kick him out. Mm-hmm. But then you kick him out, and then you don't tell anybody about him, and you just sort of say, well, we fixed the glitch. Yeah. And so I do think that it's important that we are, one of the things that, because this has happened over the past several years, that when we talk about radicalization in this country, it can be, it very quickly becomes politicized in the sense that people say, oh, you're biased in some way because you're claiming this guy is a threat and not that guy. But we should be open to, that we should be collecting information. We should be aware of these things. And when the police, when the FBI say we are worried about this, we should be smart enough to put aside our concerns, right? I mean, because what I worry about is what happened is the FBI was saying this was going to happen on the 6th of January. And the people in the executive branch were thinking, well, but these are our people. So either they won't be that bad, or even if they're bad, they'll be for us. And we need a more healthier sense of mutual responsibility than was shown. But unfortunately, going back to the topic we've already talked about, right? Unfortunately, you still have the problem of you've got to collect the information, but you can't arrest people for thought crime, and you can't arrest people for pre-crime. You would like to be able to catch them before they do anything.
Yeah, like the people in Guantanamo Bay.
I mean, this, of course, the people in Guantanamo, right? That let's say we in the United States have less trouble locking people up for thinking about doing things when they're not American citizens.
Yeah.
And, and that's something, once again, that we need to think about as well, right? Is that the most, if that ends up creating even more recruits for Al-Qaeda, is that the best way to deal with terrorism anyway?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and this is, as we say, the United States is a manifestly imperfect country, just like everybody else. And so, we can be aware of our imperfections, but if we think that the society is worth making better, then we can never give up trying to make it better, even if we want to.
In your opinion, I'm going to end with a fun.
Okay. My opinion alone.
Yeah. Have I been radicalized?
It sounds as though you're more radical than although this is the thing, MK, and I'm trying to think about the best way to put this, right?
Yeah,
is that you are, we didn't have a lot of, specifically political discussions back when we were when you were a student back at the, fancy unnamed university. And yet but even at the time, right, you were fearless, you were opinionated, you were strong, right? You were thoughtful and sharp enough to say exactly what you think. And those qualities are always in short supply and always in demand. And so, your political activities are rather more radical now. Probably they were before when you were getting an MBA.
It's true.
But I don't think it's fair just to say that you've been radicalized. I mean, I think it's to say that you are putting your talents to use to try to push society in directions that it is not necessarily ready to go yet.
It's true.
And we need that.
God, I hope so, because it would be nice to be able to call the police someday and say, hey, I'm scared, have them do something personally. Yeah. I hope that day never comes for you, but because that's when most of us became, if we were to be labeled radicalized, that's when it would happen.
And it would. And that's where, if people, and this is, like I say, that especially for people who are big, for a long time, right, the people who are strong advocates for the police, while saying, we don't understand why people are so angry at the police. Well, if police, that we need to have honest conversations about the shortcomings of our police institutions, just so that we can figure out, why is it that people don't trust the police? It's not enough to say, well, you should, and once again, I know police, I know folks who are perfectly wonderful, who are in various police functions, but that doesn't mean that these are institutions without problems. And if you want people to trust you, act in a trustworthy manner. If you want people to believe that you treat everybody with equal respect, treat everybody with equal respect.
I know lots of really great, smart, incredible men who dismiss everything I say, who work with my husband, and it's not actually a problem, all the things I do, because it's like, you can't control your wife, right? Bless his heart. It actually kind of works in his advantage. Can you believe he's married to her? So that gives me more license to do whatever it is I want to do, because the consequences for me are so small. And I'm so easy to dismiss, which is the crux being a white woman, and the power as well. It's why I'm surprised I can't get more people with my pedigree and respectability to show up yelling the way I do, the way we did at the Women's March. Because at the end of the day, we wouldn't have had a Women's March if institutions had worked for us, if we'd been comfortable saying Me Too, if people had listened when we did, we wouldn't have gotten to this point. So I'm kind of mad that the march didn't go far enough. And I'm never going to love seeing windows break. I'm not going to cry too hard when I see it happen either, especially when those people have been consistently upping the police presence in areas that have led to the murder of Black people I know, that have voted yes on the contracts to keep supporting the company that beat Rivero Stinnett nearly to death on public transportation, only for the police to then turn around and say, hey, we'll do it. We'd love to beat Black people to death, and try to take that contract in a city council meeting, which was kind of fun to watch. And when this becomes the circle of not, I'm going to do differently, just, hey, why not? It's hard not to become, and then to be dismissed as others is radicalized or feared. Like, oh, that justifies. I didn't know why I felt so uncomfortable around this really strong, passionate woman who says what she thinks, and she's going to tell me I'm ugly and stupid and mean, and probably racist too. But she's been radicalized. Of course, it's what she's going to do. It just becomes another word that I fear, because it's a way of dismissing people who didn't just wake up one day and wanted to break things. They had a legitimate gripe. They did things the right way, and the system failed them too, in ways where, do I care if I move forward? Not really, because I can't see a future that's anything other than crap for me or my offspring. And until we're sort of seeing the beauty and the desperation on that side too, then we're really just treating one side as bad. We're both sides of it. And that's what scares me.
Yeah. And once again, people, if we want people to be hopeful about the future, we all have a responsibility to, and I will say that people who are in positions of authority have a special responsibility to show they're serious about giving people hope, right? Because ultimately, we can talk about the need for compromise, whatever that means, but it's not enough. Say after an election or in any society, it's not enough for the people in charge, people at the top, to tell the people at the bottom, y'all need to adjust to this. You need to accept this.
If what I'm compromising includes my safety, then I'm not compromising.
And you're not compromising. And ultimately, it's the people who have the power who also have to take the bigger steps to reach out to their fellow citizens who do not have the power. It's not enough to tell just like after an election, it's not for the winner to tell the loser, now you have to agree with everything. It's for the winner to say, I have, that I recognize the position that I am in, and that the responsibilities that I have also, that one of the responsibilities I have is to make sure that we all live together in peace. And so I'm going to show you that there is a place for you to engage in these debates, to share power, to be a part of the society, right? That's what Well, that's what servant leadership is supposed to be about, to use a phrase that's common in certain circles. If we're serious about that, then that means recognizing that sometimes precisely because you have the power to do things is why you should make clear that you're not going to do them. Right. I can, if somebody who has the physical ability to intimidate you physically chooses not to because they realize it would be wrong to do it. Right. That's what leadership is. That's what's admirable. It is not admirable to exercise your power because you have power. Admirable, admirable leadership comes when people use their to raise up their fellow citizens, not when they simply use it to reassert their position.
Well, I am going to be waiting for a politician to say with great power comes great responsibility, but I don't think Spider-Man's running this year. And with use your power for the forces of good, I don't know. That's why I'm part of the resistance, but hey, we'll take it.
Well, I'm not on any ballot this year either, MK. So, but I am on your show, and that's been a lot of fun. So thanks for that.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for this conversation. And if you guys have more questions or comments for Mr. Granieri, can they find you on Twitter? Would you rather
find me on Twitter? I am at Ronald Granieri on Twitter.
Amazing. Thanks again, and I'll see everyone at the City Council meeting.